Hi everyone, welcome to another couple of videos for Com1. This is going to be two separate videos. The first video is going to be on how to use hatches in Rhino, and the second video will be how to use hatches in Illustrator. They're slightly different, and so it's worth going over both of these two methods separately, and then you can kind of decide yourselves which method you'd prefer to use, and perhaps it'd be a combination of the both. So first, I'll just explain how hatches work and what they are. So the hatch command in Rhino allows you to fill an area of a closed curve with a block color. And you can also add patterns and different shapes and sizes to those hatches. So I'll just explain the mechanics of how that works. So if I draw a rectangle, for example, just draw it in the middle of my screen. That's a closed curve. So we know what that is because we've gone over that before. If I explode this rectangle, it gets divided into 4 separate lines. You won't be able to hatch this because it's not a closed shape. So I'm just going to undo what I did, and okay, we've got a closed rectangle here. So the way the hatch command works is you type in hatch into your command bar, hatch, H-A-T-C-H, hit enter. Then it will ask you to select the curves you want to hatch. So I'm going to select that square that I drew. Go enter when I've selected that object, and there we go. It'll become a blank fill. You also should get this prompt when you hatch, which will allow you to start to change the properties of that hatch. So you can change it to a series of horizontal lines, double horizontal lines. You can get patterns like squares, sort of triangles, plus symbols, and these are the default settings. You can add additional hatches, and I might go over that a bit later. The other thing you can do in this prompt is you can start to change the settings of the hatch. So that's what these two sort of text boxes are for. So the first one is rotation. So as the name suggests, it allows you to rotate the hatch. So if I type in, say, 45, that's 45 degrees. Oops. Okay, we've lost. If you hit enter, you'll lose your prompt box and it will finish the hatch. So you can see that those lines have been rotated. Let me just pull that back up again. So I'm just going to delete that. I'm just going to do that again. Hatch. Okay, hits that prompt box again. So you need to type in 45 and then click away from the text box rather than hit enter, and that'll input the sort of the setting that you've put in. You can also change the scale. This is quite important because it'll change sort of the size of the hatch. So if I change that to scale to sort of 5, you can see that it's quite a nice size there. You've got a series of individual lines. You can go quite big, so you can go to kind of 40 and you might get sort of a few lines. And it's important to kind of play with the scale as you go. So maybe 5 is something that's quite good. So that's how you edit hatches in Rhino. So that's the basics of the hatch, but you can also get quite complicated with hatching. So if I draw a series of curves like so, and I just draw them and I intersect them in various spots, I can actually hatch all of these different sort of the closed shapes that are created individually. So the way I would do this is I select all the curves that I've just drawn and I type in hatch. Now, there are two things that will happen here. If you do this and you type in hatch, it may automatically hatch all the areas by itself. If it does that, there should be a little option to press which says boundary. Click on the boundary and it'll allow you to select individual areas. Let me just see if I can pull that up. So if I type in a rectangle again, draw a rectangle, type in hatch. Okay, so here. So on the Mac, it'll be here. On the PC, it'll be probably you type in B to select boundary. Select that, and that'll allow you to manually hatch any object you want. So if I type in hatch, it'll say boundary. I select all of the curves that I want to hatch and I hit enter. Then I get the option to kind of start to hatch the sort of the spaces made by the lines that I just created. and you can see that the hatches where they're going to go defined by this light gray box with a dark black outline. So let's say I want to hatch these areas. I hit enter, and they'll all hatch to the same settings as I had last time. So I can change that to a block hatch, to a line hatch, and I can again rotate these into different shapes as I see fit. Enter. Then I can also select that again, and I can go hatch, and I can hatch the other areas, and I can maybe give those a different scale and rotation, something like that. Go apply. Now I've got two different hatches. You can also select the hatch as it becomes kind of a shape by itself. And so you can move these around, you can manipulate them, you can resize them. But it's important to try to leave them in their original spot because it can be quite difficult to move them back into place. So usually when you type in move to move a hatchback, you can get an outline. However, if you're using a previous version of Rhino, like Rhino 6, it's actually really hard to move those back into place. You can start to get really creative with hatches as well, and you can start to overlap hatches on top of each other. So if I draw another rectangle just above this rectangle and maybe another one, I'll hatch this one with sort of triangles. Go OK. And I'll hatch this one with squares. You can start to move these hatches on top of other hatches to create sort of new and interesting patterns. And you might be thinking about something like subterranean soil. And so overlapping hatches kind of creates these cool, interesting relationships. So if you've got sort of a series of underground conditions, or if you're sort of drawing things like leaves or kind of debris, you can start to kind of create your own individual shapes and start to overlap them. So if I was drawing some kind of debris, I could do something like this. I could hatch this first shape with sort of lines and give them sort of a diagonal. Just going through this quite quickly because it's kind of up to you to experiment with this tool. I hatch this other shape with sort of maybe horizontal lines and a much finer scale. And then maybe I'll hatch this one with dashed lines and vertical lines and maybe slightly larger scale. This can start to create some kind of interesting sort of relationships amongst the shapes themselves. I can actually then go in and I can delete the exterior curves, and you kind of get this slightly more ephemeral, looser sort of shape to your hatches, which can be quite nice. So that's kind of the basic of hatches. You can also edit the hatches by going into your Properties tab. So on Mac, luckily, I think when you select the hatch, the Properties tab automatically opens. If you haven't got that, I believe you can go to Window, or I think you can just type in Properties, actually, and that'll bring up the properties of the hatch. If you're on PC, you may need to select it, so it should be in your Layers tab. It should be the second option in your Layers tab, and that'll select Properties. Or you can type in Properties on the PC as well. And in the Properties, you can re-edit. So if you don't like it, you can go 6, and you can change that hatch. Great, so that's the basics of how to use the hatch tool in Rhino. The next thing to consider that's really important is how to export your hatches to Illustrator. So it's not as simple as just selecting what you want and going File, Export Selected. If you do this, Tom test, downloads. If I just export this, so just doing this quickly because there's an export video already, I'll let Illustrator open up in the background. What you'll find is that these objects just become blank colors, and you don't get the kind of the really specific hatches that you've created. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to actually explode these hatches before you export them. Great, so Illustrator's opened. Let me just open this up. Okay, so Illustrator's opened. So yeah, these are the hatches if you export them just the way they are. So they just come out as these kind of blobs, which won't work. So what you need to do in Rhino is you need to select the hatch and type explode. That will separate any hatch into the individual lines used to make it up. It's really important to stay organized when you're doing this. So what I'll actually do is I'm going to create an individual layer for each hatch. So I'm just going to go change object layer. So I'm just going to put that onto its own layer, hatch 1. Then I'm going to move this onto its own layer as well, hatch 2. And I'm actually going to move this onto its own layer as well, hatch 3. Then I need to go back and I need to explode these other two. So explode, explode. And now what you've got is you've got individual lines for those hatches, which is great. Now I can just select those 3 layers and go select objects. That'll select everything on those 3 objects. So you can click, hold shift, click to select multiple layers. Right click those layers and type select objects, and that'll select everything on those layers. Then I'll go file, export selected. I'm going to export over the top of the Tom test. Export, yes, replace that. Keep the scale, that's good. Delete this, go file, open up the test that I just did, and there we go. Now the hatches have come into Illustrator as lines, and I've kept my layers, which is great. So I can really quickly, and again, I've gone over this in another video, make all the line work just black, change that line weight to something really fine, like 0.15, and then I can go through and I can individually change the layers. Maybe I want this one to be 0.05, and maybe I want this one to be 0.1, and maybe I want this one to be 0.08. And maybe I'll give this an opacity, so change that down to 80%. Maybe I'll change that one down 50%. I'm not actually sure if I've gone over opacities in Illustrator before, but this is the basics of opacities. It's pretty simple. Just select the layer that you want to change the line work of, go to opacity, and you can slide that bar. And there you go. Now you're getting some kind of really nice and interesting and specific hatches into Illustrator. So that's the basics of hatching in Rhino. Feel free to experiment with it. It's pretty simple, but it can be used to great effect. And the next video will be about how to use the Illustrator hatches. Okay, thanks.